Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nature Connects, the Nature Conservancy's webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers from around the world. My name is Heather Furman. I'm the State Director for the Nature Conservancy in Vermont, and I am delighted to be your host today and appreciate you joining us. Today, we're going to be talking with Dr. Mark Anderson, Director of Science at the Nature Conservancy. He's based in Boston, Massachusetts, and he's joining us from his home there. For more than a decade, Mark and his team of scientists have been mapping places across the US that, if sufficiently protected and restored, can help nature thrive in a time when we're seeing a dramatic decline in wildlife and new pressures on species in the face of climate change. Mark recently wrote about his pioneering approach in his op-ed in the Boston Globe, and his science is now being adopted by nonprofits and government agencies across the country as we work together to sustain biodiversity on our planet. Mark will present today for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take audience questions. As you think of questions from Mark, please enter them in the Q&A box at the top of or at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so let's dive in. Mark, thank you for being here today and welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, let me get my presentation up. Thank you, Heather. Can you see this?
Looks great, Mark.
Okay, great. Oh, start my video. All right, thank you very much, Heather. I'm so excited to be here today, and thank all of you who are joining this webinar. I know it's difficult to take time out of your life in the middle of the day, but hopefully this hour will be productive, and thank you again for taking that time. As Heather said, I'm the Director of Science for the Eastern US, and I've been leading the national work to identify and prioritize climate resilient land. And in this short presentation, I'm going to walk you through some of the concepts of climate resilient land, and then throw out some ideas for how we might really scale up and coordinate our conservation efforts to have a larger impact on conserving nature's diversity. So before I start in, first of all, I need to thank a lot of people. The work you'll be seeing today was done over 12 years, which took us 12 years to do this. And it's involved over 287 scientists. So to get this work done, we actually split the country into 9 separate regions. And in each of those regions, we had a large steering committee, which we recruited of agency, academic, NGO partners, and TNC staff, scientists. And it's really, so here you see in the top, you see the Great Lakes Steering Committee, or a part of it. And in the lower part, you see part of the Rocky Mountain Steering Committee. It's really been the work of that group who we argued out these concepts, we tested them on the ground, they reviewed all the maps, and it's really the work of these steering committees that I think made the work much more credible and usable for thinking about climate change. In all, you can see what it was a super inclusive and transparent process, and we wanted it to be that way so that as we got to the end where we are now, we have a lot of already engagement and buy-in from agencies, across the country. I also really want to highlight these 3 women in the circles in the middle, Melissa Clark, Arlene Olivero, and Annalie Barnett, who did all of the incredible GIS work that you will see today, along with some of their counterparts in California and the West Coast, and Eric Martin, who designed the web tool that we'll send you the link to so you can explore all this data. And also just thanks to the Doris Duke Foundation, US Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, and the Donnelly Foundation, all of who supported this work as it developed. Okay, so let me start by saying, what is the problem? What is the problem we've been trying to solve with this climate resilience work? And in TNC, we have a saying, which I love, that says, we envision a world where people and nature thrive. I've been with TNC for 28 years. And for a lot of that time, we have done some incredible work. And I guess I thought maybe we were winning this game, but in the last 10 years, and really in the last 5 years, it's become clear that we are not winning this game and that we are in a crisis of biodiversity. It started partly about 10 years ago as our technology got good enough that we could start actually tracking loss at a scale we never had before. Here's a map created by the Adirondack chapter of the Nature Conservancy of temperate mixed forest. This is the distribution of that habitat type 200 years ago at the turn of the century. Here's the distribution now. And this story is not unique to temperate mixed forest. If you look across the globe, habitat after habitat, we've lost the absolute amount of the habitat, and the habitat has become degraded through fragmentation and chemicals and various things. So that's been pretty clear for about a decade, but it was really only in the last 5 or 6 years that we begin to see the response of our own biota to that change in habitat loss and degradation. And it first became clear with a study done in 2004 on North American mammals. They really focused on carnivores and ungulates. And they did a very simple study. This was Lalibert and Ripple, very simple study where they just looked at the distribution of each of these mammals in 1959. And then they looked at what the current distribution is. And what they saw was that there were a couple of mammals that have expanded and are now more widely distributed than they used to be. And these mammals, coyote, raccoon, fox, skunk, they're really mammals that are very tolerant of living and working with humans. But what they also found was that the vast majority of our mammals, their distributions have shrunk. And you can look here at the pictures, some of them have shrunk by 20 to 30%. A lot of our large cats, 30 to 40% of their range has compressed down. As you go farther, 40 to 60, and all the way up to 80% for some of our mammals like grizzly bear. And what that means is that they used to be widespread, and now all that's left are small fragments of their population. So this study was followed by a global study in 2018 on mammals that was even more sobering, where if you looked at the biomass, essentially the weight of all the mammals on Earth now, 96% of that is either human beings or our domestic animals. And all of the wild mammals really now constitute just 4% of the biomass of mammals. Well, this was sobering stuff, but it wasn't the end of the news. It was followed by the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services published a report in 2018 that showed this abundance crisis, this drop in abundance was common across native species across the globe. So across the globe, the biomass of native species is down by about 20% since 1900. 30% of our amphibians are now threatened and endangered globally. Butterfly abundance is down 35%, and that is almost across the board for all sorts of insects. So we've had giant drops in insect populations, including, as most of you know, our pollinators and insects that we really need for a lot of essential services. And then finally, at the end of 2018, there was another study that came out in Science that looked at the abundance of birds in North America, and where we've been tracking this very carefully for a long time. And what they found was since 1970 until 2018, the abundance of birds has dropped 29%. That's 3 billion less birds on the landscape than there used to be. And those drops were pretty apparent in every habitat. You can see these bars of different colors. Those are how much they've dropped in each habitat. So if you've noticed, and you might have noticed this because you can see it, there seem to be less birds, less fireflies, less insects, less frogs, it's really happening. There was one bright spot in this bird study, which was there was one habitat in North America where birds have gone up in abundance, and that was our wetlands. And the authors of the studies looked at the cause of that, and they attribute it to two things: better harvesting, better management of hunting and harvesting. So that's good. But mainly billions of dollars spent on wetland protection and restoration, essentially suggesting that if we can protect and restore these habitats, we can reverse these trends that we're seeing across the globe. And finally, I don't want to start with all bad news, but finally, there is one more issue that we're dealing with, which is our climate is changing. And there's debate, or not really any debate anymore about why it's happening, but there's no debate about, is it happening? It is happening. And in response to that, a lot of people think of climate change as a threat, but I think of it as a little different. It's a change in the ambient conditions. It's a change in the temperature and moisture patterns. And when the temperature and moisture patterns change, then nature has to move and rearrange. And that rearrangement is already happening. There was a great study done in 2017 that looked at trees. These are eastern trees, and they used our own government FIA data, where we have data going back 50 years. And they looked at 86 tree species, and they asked the question, has the center of this range shifted over these last 50 years? And sure enough, they found almost every one of them had shifted either northward or west, and about 11 miles west and 10 miles north was the average. And that's simply the Midwest. As you can see in this map here, the blue area, the Midwest has gotten wetter. So trees that were restricted because it was too dry have started moving, westward. And the North has gotten warmer. So trees that were restricted by cold have started moving northward. So we're getting this mass rearrangement of nature. Okay, hopefully that's all the bad news, but this news has been sobering enough. I mean, these are real patterns. These are not predictions, that somebody has made. These are real patterns that are happening now on the landscape. And in response to that, the Nature Conservancy has vastly scaled up our ambition and our goals for the protection of land and water. What you see here is what we call the resilient and connected network. It's what you might call a blueprint of land to conserve, that if conserved could sustain biodiversity while allowing it to move and adjust to climate change. And I'm going to walk you through the creation of this network, which is based on really three things: identifying climate resilient land that will sustain nature, even as nature shifts and changes. It also looks at connectivity, connections and linkages between land that allow nature to move and find new habitats because of that changing moisture and temperature. And third, biodiversity. Where is our intact, vibrant biodiversity that we want to sustain and we want to move and change? So I'll walk you through this science very high level view of it, but there's lots you can dive into if it gets your interest. So to start with, the first piece, the resilient land, how do you find land that is resilient to nature? Well, we base it on these concepts that we call conserving nature stage, and it's based on really looking at the property of land itself. So on the left, you see a slide. This is a geology slide for the East. And it turns out, biodiversity is not random out there. Biodiversity is tightly correlated with the properties of land, particularly soil, geology, elevation, topography. And we can use that property of the land to understand where nature is now and where it might be in the future. And we can develop a map that really makes sure that we represent all the different types of land that will be needed in the future to sustain the full diversity of the East in this case, or the whole US in the case of the whole map. So we're using that for our ecological representation, we call it. And then we focused in on resilience. And our key to resilience is to look for places that have connected microclimates. And you already know microclimates because you see them all the time. Here's a great, climate. The climate that is being measured by climate change models is the climate above the ground, but the climate on the ground is a little different because the land itself, particularly the topography and the aspect, break the climate into microclimates. And you've seen these in this picture on the top. You can see this is an area where there's like a 20-degree moisture difference between the south-facing aspect and the north-facing aspect. And you get different species on those two aspects. And you can see the same thing here with temperature, where you have snow still on the north slope and, open ground on the south slope. And these kind of microclimates create climate variation on the ground. So the land itself is creating this variation. Here's a little graphic of Mount Mansfield in Vermont. The different colors on this graphic present different microclimates. And you can see that area has a lot of microclimates, and species that live in that area can just move around, rearrange, and find their local climate without having to leave the land. So it's land that will retain its species and allow them to persist and thrive. When you apply that model, I just skipped over about 10 years of work here, but when you map out all the microclimates in the country and you identify the places that you see in green here, those are the places that have the most connected microclimates for all the different types of soil and geology. I like to just think of it as, these are the places where nature can thrive and persist, all types of nature. And I really hope you notice this long green chain around the Appalachians in the east. The Appalachians is the eastern center of resilience, really. There's been 1 million tests now done on microclimates, and more studies come out every day. But my favorite actually was this one done by a staff member at the Vermont TNC office who took some students out to an area that was mapped as highly resilient in our resilience map. And they simply took soil temperatures. They climbed up the slope and down the other side, and they took soil temperatures along the way, and they noted there were some changes in the bedrock. And if you look down in this lower corner, this orange line on the graph, you can see that they found in the soil on one day there was 8 degrees difference in the soil temperature. That is a lot of difference, in a single day, especially in the soil. So that's an example of how the microclimates create these temperature difference. You can see the moisture differences, and how having a lot of climatic options available in your microclimates can allow nature to persist much longer. Those of you on this call who are wine lovers or wine drinkers, this is very similar to what the wine enthusiasts call terroir, the microclimates and soils that you can actually taste the differences in different wines. It's the same idea, only here it's much more direct because it's different species and different climates. Okay, so that gives you an idea. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Okay, that gives you an idea of the resilience. We also want to look at connectivity, and this is a map, a wall-to-wall map of connectivity done in a very coarse scale using some new technology. And on this map, you see mammals in pink, birds in blue, and amphibians in yellow. And this is where they would be projected to move if they were following their climates, And the thing I want you to notice is that some of this movement is very spread out and diffuse. We call it diffuse flow. but there's other places where all those movements get concentrated in a narrow area we call concentrated flow. And you see that going up the Appalachians here. Well, we took this technology, this is very, very coarse scale, what you're looking at here, but we actually drove it down to a fine scale where we could use it for planning. And that map at a fine scale for the US looks like this, where the diffuse flow is in blue and the concentrated flow is in orange. And in the east, I just want you to see, so you take the flow, the climatic gradients, we put into the models all the fragmenting features on our landscape, development, roads, industrial agriculture, industrial forestry. And they created resistance, not barriers, just resistance to flow. And you see where the flow, it gets concentrated and right down the darkest blue in this middle map. You know, the darkest blue are the high flow areas that are very important to protect and retain if we're going to allow nature to move and rearrange. And lastly, we wanted to look at where biodiversity is now. So a lot of that is about resilient land and climate flow, but where is the biodiversity now? And luckily to do that, we had a long history of work done both by TNC in what they called eco-regional plans, and also by our state wildlife action plans that are done by every state, where they identify conservation opportunities areas that are important for, you know, their intact habitats, their viable populations of rare species, or their important wildlife areas. And we could map all those out on the map as you see here. And so finally, if you're like me, you probably would think, well, what does it look like if you put all three of those together? You know, biodiversity values, resilient land, and flow. And that is exactly what we did. We stacked them up. And on this map now that you see for the country, the dark green areas have all three. You know, they are resilient land with intact biodiversity, and they're positioned within those climate flow areas. So they are positioned in a way that could allow nature to move and change. And that total network comes again to about 33% of the land. Here's a more detailed view of that network where you can see a little better the coastal areas. There's a lot of coastal areas where salt marshes might migrate inward that are shown in pink here. And then we can break that network down as much as we want into all, you know, the purposes and the diversity that's there. That's what you're seeing here. But what it has is, you know, so it's arranged to maximize flow. It's got resilient examples of all the different physical habitats with high microclimates and high connectedness, and about 250,000 intact biodiversity, important biodiversity sites. And it's currently about 44% secured. I'll show you more of that in a moment. So this starts to approach, you know, what a lot of scientists have now started to ask as in response to this biodiversity crisis. You know, many scientists have started to say we need about 30% of the landscape conserved by 2030. It's 30 by 30. You've probably heard of this. The Convention on Biodiversity has called for 30% of the landscape in a well-connected, effective system of protected areas. And just a few weeks ago, the Biden administration announced an executive order to try and accomplish 30 by 30. And that order has, according to the papers, 86% public support. So there is huge support for this scale of conservation, you know, in order to bring the rest of, you know, biological diversity along with us into the future. How am I doing on time? Let's see.
You're doing fine, Mark.
Okay, great. I want to end with a couple of things on thoughts on how do we conserve a network like that, you know? So the first, you know, conservation, the devil's in the details, but at TNC, we believe that this conservation is going to require a mix of strategies, you know, including permanent protected lands. We're also going to need multiple use lands, you know, that are well-managed public lands, and sustainably managed private lands where, and it's really all types of conservation strategies can work together to conserve that network. We also know that we're going to have to build public support for this, so the first thing we've started to do is quantify all the other benefits you would get from conserving this network. So this is just a look at the eastern network, so just the eastern part of the US, but just see here, every year that network produces 1.8, it produces enough oxygen for 1.8 billion people. It sequesters, or it has 56% of all the above ground carbon stock. It contains 75% of our high value source water areas that we want uncontaminated and clean. It mitigates about 1.3 million tons of atmospheric pollution, and it generates some unknown number, according to the recreation industry, about $25 billion of recreation funds. So it's got huge benefits for people. This is sort of hot off the press. We just put this in the tool. I just want you to see the Appalachians here. This is our current forest carbon stocks in the US, with our heaviest stocks are in the Pacific Northwest, that bright red. It's over 150 metric tons per acre. And our second largest stocks are here in New England, where the blue, about 100 to 150 tons per acre of existing carbon. We don't want more carbon going into the atmosphere, so we don't want to lose these carbon stocks on the ground. But watch the Appalachians when we project future carbon stocks over the next 40 years. Now you see these greater than 100 tons per acre covering really the whole Appalachian chain, and down into the coastal areas. So really important for carbon stocks. The fastest, cheapest way, to remove carbon or to sequester carbon for the future. We also, you're probably wondering, well, how much of this network is actually under conservation right now? Well, here's a great picture. It's about 44%. And if you look at this second map, I've whited out all the lands that are secured against conversion, which include a lot of our public lands, multiple use lands, as well as our protected lands. And what you see is that in the West, a lot of the network is on public lands. So a major strategy in the West is to ensure that those lands are managed, in a biodiversity friendly and sustainable way. So just management of public lands is an important strategy. In the middle part of our country, there's a lot of need for direct new securement and conservation action and better stewardship by our current land managers. So and then if you look to the east, you see a mix of strategies needed. One of our biggest opportunities that we've really begun is simply talking with tribal leaders on all these indigenous lands. So if you look at our, indigenous sovereign nations, there's about 29 million acres of resilient connected land that is on native lands. And we've begun conversations, just sharing the science, hearing their own approaches and their own science, and just getting these dialogues going about, how do we work together to sustain nature? And of course, there's work for TNC to do. If you look at the lands that TNC has conserved, we've made a huge impact on this resilient connected network. Here you can see them all, about 3.7 million acres. And we ourselves have committed to try and doubling the pace of our own, conservation through fee and easement land. It's trying to focus on the larger and more complex deals where TNC skills are uniquely needed. And we have a web tool. There's a link, nature.org Natural Highways, if you want to explore this network and look at some of the cool TNC projects. You can go to this and you can zoom around the network and click on these different buttons, and it will tell you about the project. There's a photo and description. Lastly, I really want to emphasize, this is huge. This is way, way beyond what we can do alone as an organization. So we really have to develop partnerships. I mean, we've always been developing partnerships, but it scales it up. here's a picture of Andrew Bowman, the CEO of the Land Trust Alliance, showing the map to 1,000, at a Land Trust Alliance rally with 1,000 land trusts represented, and challenging land trusts. Can we coordinate our work? Can we work together to have a larger impact by, helping each other to conserve this network? And finally, our last strategy is really just distributing the science. Nobody wants to follow somebody else. Nobody wants somebody else to tell them what to do. And we get that. I get that too, But what we can do is we can provide the science in a way that other agencies and organizations can bring the science into their own planning. And we've been very successful at this. We've got Fish and Wildlife Service, many of the state wildlife action plans are being revised. U.S. Forest Service, they've all incorporated this data into their own planning. And many of the land trusts have been incorporating the data into their planning. And we think that is really the sweet spot, in how we have an impact, is figuring out how to make this science usable, by many different partners so that we can all sort of use the same set of information. And to do that, we have created a resilient land mapping tool. Here's the link, maps.tnc.org. I think the link will be in the chat. And this tool will allow you to go to zoom in and explore this. You can look at resilience and connectivity and biodiversity. You can even look at carbon. You can calculate it you can draw your own polygon here, sketch a polygon, and it will calculate all these statistics and tell you, how much diversity and resilience is there and how much carbon. And this has been getting a huge amount of use, 12,000 visits in the last 6 months. And, we're hoping that this tool can really help us get the science out. And all that information is on the Nature Conservancy's Gateway website. And you can go there to find all the reports, all the papers, the web tools, the story maps, and you can download all the data sets. So we've made everything publicly available. And we hope, that if you're thinking about this, that it can help you in your own thinking and planning for diversity, even in your own local neighborhood. So with that, thank you very much. And we'll take questions.
Wonderful. Mark, thank you so much. Every time I hear you talk, it's an inspiration. It feels like we are making progress. There's a real call to action. I see we're really making progress with our state and local partners and getting the science out there. So thank you for that. I see a lot of questions coming in the Q&A, and if you could put your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat box, because I probably can only monitor one of these at a time. And we will, however, put the links. I think our colleagues here have already put the links that Mark put up on the website or as part of the presentation into the chat so that you can go and explore the information yourself. So I'm going to just jump into questions because we have a lot coming in here. I want to see, I'll start with a question about the microclimates map, Mark. I was shocked to see how bad the Maine woods were in the microclimates map. Can you explain this? Can you help explain that to us?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for asking a question about microclimates. It's my favorite topic. So the microclimates are being measured within an ecoregion, and in those Maine woods are being compared to the Northern Apps ecoregion. So the way they're being calculated is, we look across that entire region. What's the average amount of microclimates, and then how do those woods compare to the average amount? And I think what you saw mostly was probably average. They were probably yellow, which means that the Maine woods, that is about the average for the Northern Appalachians. And the places really where they go up were usually the wetlands. So a lot of wetlands and some of the complex bogs tend to have a little more microclimates, or places where you get either river systems or foothills and mountains. And those, So take a look at that map on the web tool and see if you'll see that pattern where the average is sort of the background, and then you find the places where you get the little distinctions that are related to some natural features.
Terrific. Thanks, Mark. All right, another question. How is connectedness defined? Meaning what resolution and for whom? Does connectedness vary on the resolution of organisms considered, ants versus large mammals? And if so, how is this incorporated into your work?
Great question. Thank you for that too. I took that whole section out of the presentation. But in a very simple way, we define connectedness as the ability of essentially any natural creature, so it's not species specific, to move from a point on the landscape outward in any direction. And we map things that we call resistance to movement, and resistance are things like paved roads, sprayed fields, power lines, development. And each of those, none of those are considered a full barrier. They just have different levels of resistance. And as those things pile up, the resistance to movement increases, and the connectedness are the places where the highly connected is where there's no resistance in any direction. And high resistance is where you're surrounded by all those features of the type I recommend, or I just mentioned. So it is not a species specific model. It's really a connectedness of natural cover and resistance to movement.
Great. Hey, Mark, why don't you stop sharing your screen so people can see us, and then we can have a conversation. That's all right. So another question, this is a really interesting one that I don't know that either one of us could answer, but I like it, so I'm going to ask. When will climate zones have changed sufficiently to affect what's defined as an invasive species? And along with that, I know another question came in earlier about assisted migration, and maybe you could tackle both of those at the same time.
I'll take a stab, but jump in, Heather. Invasive species, from my perspective, it's just going to get more confusing going forward. So things are moving. If we want to retain connectivity, it's very hard to have a selective filter. So things are going to be moving on their own. And species that we're not used to seeing, say in New England, we may start seeing species that are coming up from the south, and we're going to have to think about whether how they fit into the landscape, and whether they are invasive or whether we should embrace them. I mean, this whole turnover is, I think, sort of the future of conservation. On the ground conservation is going to be a lot about thinking about the turnover of species and how we facilitate that in a way that keeps diversity, maintains diversity. Assisted migration, my own opinion, not TNC opinion. I don't think we have a formal opinion, but I think this is serious. I think we're going to have to go there. I think as best we can, we need to have places for things to go, but we will probably have to help with that movement. You saw the maps, and you saw the trends. We may have missed our chance for this to take care of itself, but that's my own opinion.
Yeah, if those linkages and connected areas aren't there, then what happens?
And what do we do?
Yeah, what do we do? So yeah, I think it's a great question to keep thinking about and talking about. Okay, I've got a couple questions in here. Some folks very, very interested in how Nebraska showed up on your map. Large swaths in Nebraska that has high value in your study. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And are TNC and other partners acting to restore prairie plants and communities there? Am I right in understanding that prairies, grasses and forbs with their deep roots in the systems are an effective way to sequester carbon in the ground?
Oh, great question.
Yeah.
Well, so first why is there a big green blob in Nebraska? Well, that's the Nebraska sandhills. So And just, to remind you of that resilience map looks at all the different soil types, including sand, and finds the places with the most connected microclimates. And the sand hills just pop out. When you compare it to all the other sand that's out there in the Midwest, at least in that ecoregion, the sand hills with their really complex physical structure, they're a really cool place. And they are very intact. They call them the Midwestern Yosemite, really pop out as important. Now, none of the sandhills is under, well, very little of the sandhills is under any sort of conservation or protection right now. And the TNC offices there are really working to develop what they call a culture of stewardship among many of the private landowners, so that we start to have a culture that really values biodiversity and manages land in ways to retain biodiversity. And that includes better storing of carbon, because those prairie plants, if you've ever seen those slides of like native prairie plant roots compared to most of our agriculture roots, they can be huge carbon sinks, but or huge carbon stocks, I should say. But we have to restore that carbon back in the ground. So there is a lot of work going on to do that. So I'll stop there.
Yes, the carbon questions, they're coming in, and I'm going to try to find, hold on just one second. There's a really good one here. Here it is. As you predict future carbon storage across the Appalachians, and I don't know that we're predicting future carbon storage across the Appalachians yet, but we're really excited about what carbon storage exists there. Are you assuming a certain rate for forest reclamation and restoration? Has that been factored into any of your work yet, Mark?
Yeah, let me say, so the answer is no. So the map that I showed you, which is really hot off the press, it comes from Chris Williams' lab, and you can read about it on the Resilient Land Mapping Tool. Those methods are probably not realistic. They have great maps of current carbon stock as of 2010. And what we did is we just ran that model into the future, assuming no disturbance, because we don't know what the disturbance is going to be. And so it's really saying if this was all conserved and there was no disturbance, then this was probably what the carbon stock would be, But that is, as whoever asked that good question, the actual future will be a little different than that, and it probably won't be as high, But the trend is probably the same. But there will be disturbance management. Won't all be conserved. So.
Great. Yeah. There's a number of questions now rolling in, Mark, about water and fish, and how are we thinking about resilience, particularly for salmonoids who are at great risk from climate change. Can you talk a little bit about how you're applying this thinking to our water systems?
Yes. Wow, this is a great audience. Thank you all. These are great questions.
Lots of great questions.
Originally, we thought we could sort of get water at the same time as land, but it quickly became clear that it was too complicated. So we have now launched a parallel, what we call it, a freshwater resilience project, which is underway in the Mississippi Basin. And we're trying to look at some of the same concepts, how connected our river systems are, how much variation there is in their flow, temperature, gradients, and whether we can identify places that we think will retain their species into the future because they allow species to move around and adapt. So stay tuned. And if you're interested, send me an email. We should be starting to see results. With the project is two years long, so we probably won't have anything done for 2 years, but it's underway. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I love that we're starting to think about how this relates to our freshwater work.
Yeah.
So there's a couple questions in here about applying this science, but a lot of folks asking how they can like actually get the data sets and use it themselves. Have you tried overlaying this map with areas that are risk for development as a way to further prioritize? Similar question about how you can kind of juxtapose the science to renewable energy siting. We know that there are places where we are going to have to continue to build out to support our human population and our ever-growing energy needs. Has there been some conversations and discussion about how to use this science to look at those issues?
Great. The answer is yes. So most of this work has been done in the East. We just completed this national map in October of last year. So it's beginning in the West, but we have looked at, siting of wind in the Central Appalachians. We have looked at development pressure and where that is occurring and how that relates to the network. There's a little story map about that on the Gateway site you can look at. And but mostly the answer is mostly our state offices like Vermont and others, mostly our state offices are doing this work state by state as they really start to use the map in their own planning. So, I should make this clear, the map is pure science. It's not really a plan yet. It's not a conservation plan. And our state's offices are it's underway that they are taking this science and converting it into a conservation plan. In order to do that is when they're doing these overlays of the kind you just asked about. And, the patterns differ geographically depending on where you are and what the network looks like and what the development pressures are. So.
Yeah, lots of questions about that, that kind of finer scale, stepping down to either the regional or local scale, working with regional planning commissions or local land trusts to fine tune that. And I know just from our perspective here in Vermont, we're continuing to incorporate that into our own planning tools and working as best we can with local land trusts, Vermont land trusts, and other regional planning commissions to make that data available. So if you're not able to follow the links on that we've provided earlier, please feel free to get in touch with us. We want to ensure that as many people as possible have access and are using this for their own planning purposes. Let me see here. In the Northeast, we've gone from nearly all forests and nearly all agriculture to mostly forests. How does a typical Northeast suburb evaluate biodiversity benefits restoring meadows versus restoring forests? This is kind of a similar question of downscaling the science. Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's such a local question. So restoring meadows and restoring forests are both good things to do. So you'd have to sort of look at your site and see what was the most appropriate. Over time, forests are probably, forests are mostly the natural system on most of our lands. And over time, they really store immense amounts of carbon. Meadows do too. And maybe meadows are easier to, you can restore those faster. So you might be able to get a little more biodiversity and carbon in the short term with a meadow, but in the long term, forest will be the one to go to. So think about that in your planning.
Yeah. Let's see, I'm filtering through so many questions. This is really terrific.
These are really smart questions too.
I know. So here's an interesting one. Great and compelling case for a climate resilient strategy. That said, is there still a role for fine filter in future conservation work, i.e. rare species that do not currently occur in the mapped resilient connected biodiverse areas? Or do we need to cut our losses, so to speak? It's a provocative question. And I think about the level of analysis that you've done, Mark, with this work to really take into account the full history of TNC's work on rare and endangered species and unique biological conditions. Can you talk a little bit about that and whether there's still work outside of that needs to be done?
Yeah, God, these are great questions. So let me start by saying the climate resilience maps and the network maps are they are maps of climate resilience. They are not really maps of importance. So there can be very important places that on the maps show up as vulnerable, and it's your own, in my own opinion, yes, there are some rare species that occur mostly in vulnerable sites. And if we want to conserve them, we really should think about what's the strategy. I mean, there is a question of should we let go or should we conserve it? But if this should give us a clear picture of what conservation means, if the sites themselves are very vulnerable, that they are unlikely to persist without a lot of management and maybe the kinds of hands-on action we were talking about earlier. So, I don't, the bigger question is, how do we balance our work on that versus what it's really going to take to actually conserve the network and how we balance that. And I'll let all of you enter that for yourselves. So, or you can answer it, Heather.
There's a lot of good thinking that goes on there, and we'll have to continue to think about that one. I have a question that I really like here. Could you talk a little bit more about TNC's dialogue with Indigenous peoples in the context of land management and conservation? Any specific examples? And I know that this came up a lot as you were doing your work. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's this work to us is very important, and to me it's very important, and we are clearly sort of naturally aligned. Our conservation efforts and native indigenous efforts are very aligned towards conserving nature. However, these conversations are small. Let me say, every tribal area is a sovereign nation with its own government, its own opinions, and we have been reaching out to many of them and starting to develop these dialogues, but it's going to take time. It's going to take time. We have to really develop. There's been a lot of broken trust. We have to sort of redevelop trust. We have to listen, and we have to be open to their approaches, which we are learning a lot from. We're also learning that they find the science very cool, so it's kind of a back and forth that so far looks very promising, but it's slow. There's also lots of COVID issues right now. And I think if, my own opinion, if we're learning anything, it's that we have to slow down and work and build trust and take this slowly. If we want to really if we want to work together in the future, we just got to take the time. So
I think that's absolutely right. And there's a couple of questions here also about, expanding this work. I don't think that we showed Hawaii or Alaska on the map, and there's some interest in, the fact that we all know that political borders don't stop movement across our landscape. And so is there any conversation going on with our partners and our colleagues in Canada or Mexico? What are some plans for maybe expanding beyond the US right now, Mark?
Yeah, great. Well, in terms of Canada has a very interesting process that they call Pathway to Target 1. And Target 1 is essentially 30% of Canada by 2030. And they are really starting to take that very seriously at the governmental level. And we've been on a number of calls with them where they're just sort of looking, they're just sort of exploring the science and seeing if this is something they want to try and do themselves for, you know, for their own country. And we're having very interesting dialogue. So hopefully we'll see where that goes. It looks like a lot of interest. We may have a pilot going in the Champlain, or I should call it the St. Lawrence Valley, north of the Champlain Valley. The other question, we're almost complete with Alaska. So we are working with Alaska right now. And
Oh, great.
we hope to start Hawaii sometime soon. And then we will have the 50 states.
Terrific. Mark, there are so many questions, and I know we are running out of time. For those of you who put a question in chat, thank you so much. We will do our best to save these questions and try to get back to you with some answers. We'll go through, there's a lot of similar questions. Mark, any final thoughts about what your hopes are for the science and the future of this work as we move forward, as we wrap up today?
Well, I just thank everyone for being here. I really want to say, you know, we're working the science out as we go. I'm sure we have mistakes. I'm sure we have good ideas. We'd love to hear from you. If you've noticed things, let us know. And, you know, ultimately, this is something that we all have to do together. And I'm just hoping that the science can help inform us in a way that we can, you know, collaborate and work together on. It's
going to take all of us to get there. Well, that's it for today, folks. If you would like to support Mark's work, if you didn't get your questions answered, we have some state-based contacts for you up on the screen right now. You can reach out to the contact that's on the screen, and hopefully we can get answers to you. Or if you'd like to support our work and learn more about our work, you could reach out to these folks as well. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources that we talked about and a recording of this webinar in case you want to share it with others. So thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.